Absolutely.
You know, in 1933, you wrote a short op-ed in the New York Times.
Oh, I'm glad you saw that.
Yeah, it was lovely.
Not very many people have.
No, but more have now, because it was about your vision of what utopian schools might be. And years later, an American scholar, I've forgotten his name, William H. Schubert, wrote a book called Love, Justice, and Education, which is an expansion on your short op-ed. I wonder if you'd say a word about the utopians and you know, what a utopian school might look like today.
Well, the utopia, I can tell you a little bit about the utopian school that I visited.
You envisioned then.
I actually think maybe now, in retrospect, I have seen this book, by the way. I try to keep up, as I say. And I did see the book.
You might even be signing it later.
In the book, it suggests that well, here's the story. I was supposed to make a speech at Teachers College to a group of early childhood educators, and I woke up the next morning and I had this flash, this idea that if I pretended that I had visited a utopian society someplace, not now, mind you, a perfect society, all set and established and never improving again, but a kind of utopia that continues to improve, that I thought maybe reflects some of the ideas that I'd been trying to write about in the child and curriculum, democracy and education, and so on. And so I thought it'd be a nice ploy if I would pretend that I had visited this society somewhere. And I talked about the gatherings where young and old were in these home-like environments where they interchanged with each other, they shared what they were interested in, they shared their ideas. I called the places gatherings. They moved from person to person, or maybe stayed with a person. Young learned from old, and old learned from young. They didn't. It even made me ask whether what are your goals? And then I thought, what am I doing? I shouldn't ask. You know, it's because it's not like me. But I couldn't take it when I saw my work actually in practice, really fully in practice. And so now Schubert then said that, well, maybe I actually went into a deep dream state. And I never studied Freud or Jung, even though they were my contemporaries. I mean, I read them, but I kind of disregarded them maybe more than I should have, because maybe I went into a deep dream state and actually went to a utopian society. What do you think? Through a portal, some way.
Possible.
Could have been.
Could have been.
Could have been. But anyway, so I actually asked, do you have a copy of that book?
Yep.
Oh, thank you very much. Let me just see. Did he put my article in here? Why, he did. And so I asked them to tell me why they were able to do what they actually did. And what they did was described here by me. And I really want you to think about this, because so many schools today, so many institutions in our society are just the opposite of this. And we need to strive for this, I still think. It was an attitude that I saw in the practice that I visited, an attitude which resulted in a sense of positive power, which involved, of course, the elimination of fear, of embarrassment, of constraint, of self-consciousness, eliminated the conditions which created the feeling of failure and incapacity. Possibly it included the development of a confidence, of a readiness to tackle difficulties, of actual eagerness to seek problems instead of dreading them and running away from them. It included a rather ardent faith in human capacity. That's the faith I talked about before, the common faith. And so I asked them how they were able to get there, how they were able to do that. And they said that they had a very difficult time doing it, but what they had to do was they had to work ardently to overcome the acquisitive society, which I mentioned before, which transforms everything through greed into something to be acquired. Everything.
It's interesting because 4 years after your death, a young preacher named Martin Luther King Jr. catapulted to the national scene in the United States. And over the 15 years that he was a social activist before he was assassinated, he argued that there were three great evils in our society. There was racial injustice, there was racism, there was militarism, and there was materialism, consumerism. And he said we have to fight those evils. We have to fight for racial justice, economic justice, and global justice, peace. And I think that's something that would be very resonant with your notion of the acquisitive society and the problems that it brings. And when we cave into it or normalize it or assume it, we've given up too much.
So I think it can't, that those things, those terrible problems, cannot be overcome by some kind of top-down kind of activity or demand or mandate, but they can be overcome. My faith is they can be overcome, and Martin Luther King did a book called The Strength to Love, and by loving relationships. He talked about it in the form of agape, a form of, of love that is that's not overly sentimental, but even in the face of those difficulties, he still called for love.
Absolutely, and he wrote a book, one of the last books he wrote was called Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, which is another kind of very stark way of looking at the world we live in. But I look at something like the occupation movement today, and I think one of the things that folks here might think about is reconfiguring their conference from the notion of the power of progressive practice to occupy the progressive education network. And then you're kind of right in line with, because everything's being occupied, and it's a gesture towards participatory democracy and for standing up against the acquisitive society. I see